In this video, I'm going to be backtesting GBPUSD using a simple to follow forex strategy that you can also copy. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So the purpose of today's video is to simply go back through last month's price action on GBPUSD to backtest the month's price action to see if there were any trades that I missed, they were valid according to my strategy, and also to review the trades that we did end up actually taking. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, make sure to stick around until the end of this video. Make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and let's get straight into the video. If we just move all of this. And as always, starting off on the daily time frame and then working our way down to get a complete overview of what price action is doing. So at the beginning of February, we can see that price action wasn't looking the cleanest. It was in this sort of consolidation phase on the daily time frame. However, what I had seen at the time was that price had swept this area of liquidity just here. So we were expecting price to come lower to take out some previous buyers. You can see that once price swept this daily area to the left, we got a nice reaction and price pushed over to the downside. However, price did fail to break any significant structure. You can see that on the 4 hour at the time, we were printing a higher low, higher high, higher low, higher high, and price came down. And if you include the bodies, it did sort of create a lower low. However, we failed to close past this wick. You can see we just kind of got this manipulation of it. Same thing with this. We just had another manipulation of these two equal lows. However, what I was looking at the start of the month, I was seeing this as an area of liquidity for price to come lower and take. We had this break of structure here, which I was viewing as the main break of structure. You could obviously also label this one on as a break of structure. However, since we had this imbalance just below, leading into this area of demand, I wasn't seeing this as the main break of structure. I was sort of viewing between this low and this high as the main leg of the uptrend. So if price were to come lower than this area of demand, then I would switch my bias and look for some longer term sells playing off the daily bearish narrative. However, since we hadn't had that at this point in time, I was still looking for buys once price came into this zone. However, I was also looking for some sells to see if we can capitalize on some sells down to this level beforehand. So playing that narrative and going off the sort of internal trend, which at the time was bearish, I was basically viewing the market like this. So I was seeing that we had a sweep of this 4 hour area of supply. You can see that this area was the supply. It was imbalanced. Price initially reacted from it, then came back up, swept it, and continued over to the downside. Also, if you consider looking at this, if you don't consider the wicks, we did get a lower low created. So after a lower low is created like this, we expect a high probability of a lower high being formed. So once this area was swept, I was anticipating that price would continue lower back to this previous low. So following that, let's analyze the lower time frame price action. So what we can see is that once price swept that 4 hour level to the left, the 15-minute was overall bullish. We had this break to the upside, but once we had that sweep to the left, price then broke down, giving us that initial break of structure just here, like so. And as you can see, price then just decided to continue down, breaking past multiple areas of structure once again. So at this point in time, I was looking at basically two main zones in order to get in on the sells. So the first one, if we go over to the 30-minute, was this area of supply just here. And the second one was this extreme level, meaning that it is at the top of the range. So this one just here, which was still left in balance, as you guys can see. This partially filled it, but didn't quite touch. And yeah, another confluence that I had that price was likely to continue down. You can see on the 4 hour, we've left these sort of equal lows below. So I was at least expecting price to come and liquidate those lows before any buys resume. But preferably I was also looking for price to come down into this area of demand all the way down here. So at this point in time, I was simply waiting for one of these two zones to be hit. So if we play price, you can see that once price came into this zone, we got a sweep of the top of the supply, something that you quite often see. So a manipulation of the supply and then a breaker structure to the downside. So in this case, what we can see on the 5 minute is that the main breaker structure, in order for this trade to be confirmed, would be this low just here, as this is the most recent higher low, which puts in a new high. So if we play price, I was looking for a break of that area before considering any sells. And as you can see, we did break this level like so. However, we had this very ugly looking wick caused by news, and there wasn't really any valid zones to go off. You know, this one here, I wouldn't consider that a valid point of interest because it was already wicked out by this huge wick. So at this point in time, I just kept playing, I just kept watching price, and no valid entry presented itself. So if we just keep playing price now, so another area that I was looking at as well was this area of demand. And this was basically just playing within this range. So you could also see this as a change of character for price to come higher, then return back into this area of demand, and then break into new highs. Since this area of demand, as you can see, swept the lows to the left. So it was an area where we were expecting a reaction. However, if we go down to the 15 minute, you can see we did get this breaker structure here. However, there wasn't really, in my personal opinion, an area to go off. So I just basically waited out for that trade. And as you can see, price did end up actually continuing to the upside. However, like I said, there was no valid entry for myself. So next, I was still viewing this area up here as a valid area. So we were just waiting for price to come into that zone, and like I said, preferably come lower as well. So if we play price, you can see that once price came into this zone, we then go down to the 15 minute, and I was simply waiting for a break of some structure. This one here, it didn't really break structure. So the main area of structure that I was looking for price to break was this low just here. As you can see, we failed to break that low, and price then sweeps the high. On the 5 minute time frame, this was a good entry that we could have had. So price swept this initial high like this, and then what happened was we got a closure below this area of demand, forming a breaker structure like this. And in this case, the reason that I wasn't looking for price to come all the way and break this structure was because we just had this sort of imbalanced area just here where you wouldn't expect price to continue from. On top of that, once this area of demand failed, I saw that price had created this area of imbalanced supply just here. So ordinarily, I would have entered here. However, this was around an hour before NFP, so I didn't obviously enter this. And as you guys can see, if we had have entered the trade, NFP would have come into our zone, and then price just plummeted. So the analysis was good, but it wasn't worth the risk in my opinion, since we did have NFP coming out. And obviously if this had gone the other way, we would have probably been slipped for like an extra couple of percent. So obviously it's not worth it. So continuing price now then. Once we had a reaction from this point of interest, price then came back and broke this main structure just here. And given all of the momentum that was coming into this zone, I was just looking for further sells at this point in time, looking to take and target this previous low down here. That was my main target. So again, on the 15-minute, I was just playing price, looking to follow the sort of most recent structure that we had. And following the structure, the most recent 15-minute breaker structure was this one just here. And what I noticed as well was that we had this imbalanced level of supply just here. This high here was the Asia high. And going over to the 5-minute, you can see this was a very clean level of supply, which created imbalance, broke structure to the left. And I mentioned we have that that Asia high resting below this level. So at this point, I was waiting for price to pull back into this zone. And as you can see, when price pulled back into the zone, if we just play it a little bit, so when price initiated this pullback, it hadn't yet taken this low. And we had sort of formed these very weak looking equal lows. So I was expecting price to move down, because given all of this momentum that we had coming into this low, I didn't expect this low to hold. It was much more probable that price continued to at least liquidate this low if we were to see some buys. So that gave me sort of like an extra confluence and more confidence in looking for sells. So like I said, waiting for a sweep of this Asia high into the area of supply above, and eventually price came into our zone. Since this was a 15-minute point of interest, we can go down to the 5 and the 3-minute to look for our entries. And as you guys can see at the time, the most recent structure was this low. So that was the one I was waiting for price to close below, which, as you can see, happened in the end. And price then left all of this imbalance with this area of supply at the top. And the reason that I like this supply was because if we zoom in, you can see that this wicked out these previous sellers that we had initially within this zone and caused the breaker structure and was imbalanced. So at this point, I just set a limit on this zone. The stop loss for this was quite conservative. I had it just above the area of supply, just in case price wanted to liquidate this as early sellers. And then I was targeting a 1 to 3 just down here. Actually, I was targeting the blue line, so the stop loss was a little bit smaller, I believe around here. So if we place the order, you can see what price does. We come up into the supply, and then price turns around and heads towards the liquidity, like so. And then after this, I believe price just continued to melt, like so, with no pullbacks to get in on any more sells. But what price had done now was come into my level of demand that I had marked. So at this point, I basically deleted all of this because I was no longer interested in selling unless price broke through this level and then continued to sell. But since price was in this demand, I switched my perspective and was now looking for buys, also considering that we had just taken out this massive area of 4-hour liquidity. So I was expecting at least a reaction for price to pull back before continuing down, or just to completely reverse and continue back up. So at this point, we went down to the 15-minute, since it was a 4-hour point of interest, and the most recent structure that I could see was this lower high just here. So we were waiting for a break of that area and for price to close above the area, sorry. So if we just keep playing price, eventually, there we go. We had a closure above this level. Price created a higher high, indicating that it is likely to move over to the upside. And what I could see at the time was that we had this 15-minute level of demand. However, at the time, this level for me, it wasn't really like the best area to go off, because it was just this very small area and it didn't really leave any imbalance. So at the time, rather than set a limit at this area, I was waiting for price to come back into it and then see how price would react. So if we play price, eventually price comes into this zone, sweeping out some previous buyers. And then once price came into this level, because I was unsure about the level and because it didn't really fit my criteria perfectly, like I said, I was waiting to see how price reacted. So because this is a 15-minute point of interest, we can go down to the 3 and the 5 minute time frames to look for an entry. So once price then came into this point of interest, I was looking to analyze this current downtrend on the 3 minute, and obviously we can see the most recent high is this one. So I was waiting for a break of that, and once price broke that high, you can see that we had this very nice area 3 minute demand created. And the reason I like this as well is because price induced it with this sort of higher low just here. So what we can see from this is that if price does come into this area of demand, given that it's mitigated 15-minute demand to the left, swept some liquidity and has liquidity above it, I think there is a high probability that price will react from this level. So we had our entry set just there, stops just below the 15-minute area and targeting the most recent high. You could also say that we had like these sort of relative equal highs above as well. So we place the order. So when price was continuing up like this, if it had broken this high, I would have then deleted the limit because this entry would have been invalid. But since price didn't quite reach this high and we were also sort of forming this trend line above, this was still a valid entry. So you can see where does price come and react perfectly from. We wick into the demand after liquidating some previous buyers and then just continue up bullish as anticipated. So going back to the higher time frames. So we've now had another break of structure following on from that initial change of character. So if we mark that on just here and play price a little bit. So at this point in time, price was just moving up very correctively like this, building lots of liquidity, and there wasn't really an entry opportunity. So we can keep playing price and then see that we did break this hourly structure. So I was anticipating some sells after a sweep of this area, which price did end up doing. However, we did get an entry on this. So what I was still waiting for price to do, I was still viewing this as bullish, but I thought we may get a retracement now that that liquidity has been taken. And one of the areas that I was looking at was this 15-minute zone of demand, simply because this was at a discount of this current leg of the trend, and we had all of this trend line liquidity built above it. So before price continues higher, I was anticipating for a liquidation of all of this. And if we play price, we can see that eventually, after price sort of consolidated for a little bit, if we use the higher time frames, price makes its way to that level, sweeps the low of the demand, but fails to close below it. So if we change the color of this, so at the time, like I always do, I was waiting for price to break the internal structure, which at the time was this high just here. So if we play price, we can see that eventually price broke that high. However, at the time, there wasn't really any valid areas to enter from. So I basically just left this and waited for price to play out a bit more, which, as you can see, it eventually does. And so at this point in time, this presented a valid entry for myself, because what I was looking for price to do was at least liquidate this high, where we obviously had all of this liquidity resting above. So I was expecting price to continue bullish. We've had that initial change of character from our area of demand. And what price did now was create this sort of area of support. And below we had this area of imbalanced demand just here, as you guys can see. So if we zoom in on that a little bit, you can see that this candle was left imbalanced, and this was sort of the area of demand where this volume came back in. If price was to break this level, obviously all of this down here is efficient price action, so I was anticipating price to just continue lower. So this was a very good and high probable level to just set a limit for the buys. Had around an 18 pip stop, and I was targeting a 1 to 3 like this. So if we just place that order, we can see that eventually, once price came into our level, sort of consolidated for a bit, but then ultimately did end up continuing up. But didn't quite hit the TP just yet. So if we analyze what price is doing now, and I'm going to delete this position tool for the moment, because what we can see that price has done now is, after mitigating demand, price then came back up, breaking this area of structure, so forming a new high. And what I could see at the time was this area of demand, which was then created. This was an imbalanced area of demand. We had some liquidity resting above it as well. So I was waiting for price to simply come into this zone. And this was on the 12th of February. So if I just quickly show you that we did actually call this beforehand. So GU. There we go. So as you can see, we had this point of interest marked, and as you can see, we have the timer in the corner, meaning that it's live price and not on bar replay. So at the time, like I said, we were waiting for price to come into this zone, which eventually we can see that it did. So we can change the color of this. And then I went down to analyze the lower time frames to see what the current trend was doing. And on the 5 minute, what I did was I refined this whole zone to this 5 minute zone just here, which corresponded with this imbalance. And we also had this area of liquidity as well. Also note, what I also noticed was that as price was approaching this zone, we were building up all of this buy side liquidity for price to later take. So if we play price now and see if we get that break of structure. So here we can see at this point in time, I was actually waiting for an entry once price broke this, but we can see that we had a wick above, and then price continued lower. So there was no valid entry there. Okay, so what we were looking at now, price created a new low. Therefore, this high here is the one we want to see broken in order for the trade to become valid. And we also need to see some sort of imbalance being created as well, which, as you can see, happened very nicely. We had a sweep of these lows, price broke to the upside, and then we left this area of demand here, which was a high probable zone because it also swept liquidity to the left. So it should act as like a strong low. So we had a limit set here around an 8 pip stop. And for this, I was targeting this area here for a 1 to 3 because this was sort of the area of supply which swept liquidity and then sort of broke to the downside. So I was expecting maybe price to react from this level or even completely reverse to the downside. But what this means is essentially that even if our direction is wrong and price is bearish, we could still capitalize on this bullish move back towards that previous supply. So if we place this and see what happens, you can see that eventually price at first induced this zone, which gave me further confidence in the trade because we now have some sort of liquidity resting above the zone. So what we know is that when price sweeps liquidity, it will give a reaction, and that will be used as sort of like the catalyst or the fuel for the move higher. And as we can see, in this case, price tagged us in. It actually came back down, liquidated this initial tap. But as I always say, I never make my trades break even unless there's high impact news. And in this case, there wasn't any high impact news, so we can just keep holding. And what you will see is that once price retests the area, it then goes to the take profit. And this is really the reason why I don't make trades break even, is because my stop loss is here for a reason. If price is still within this blue zone, the trade is still valid. So why would I make break even just because price went, say, 1% in our favor and then retraced? I think that's mostly just because of a fear of a loss rather than a logical trading decision. So I didn't make that break even and just decided to hold. Also note, like we said, we had this area of supply, and once price came into it, we did get a sell back down to the blue zone. But ultimately price it came back into this blue zone once again, also sweeping this initial touch just here. And then on the 5 minute, you can see price broke structure and then just continued over to the upside. We keep playing price. There we go. We got this very impulsive move over to the upside. And I believe this was some CPI news. So the CPI news came out, and then what we expect news to do is to come down and liquidate some previous buyers before heading higher, or just to completely reverse after sweeping all of these sellers. So one of those two things could have happened, but at the time, I had this marked on because on the 1 hour, this was the change of character. And what I have noticed is that, let's say you have this initial change of character, price then retraces once again, break structure to the upside once again. Once it has done this, the newly formed trend is sort of too obvious, and you obviously have a lot of people buying within this area. So what price will often do, once we've had, say, 1 or 2 mitigations of demand, as we had here, so pull back, mitigation of demand, push up, break structure, pull back, mitigate demand, break a structure again. Once you have this sort of chain of mitigations, once price has sort of formed all of this liquidity, it will then return back down to like an extreme level of demand. So in this case, we had this one here. It was already tested and it hadn't created any imbalance, but it was an area of demand nonetheless. And obviously we had all of this built up liquidity in the demand chain just above. So I was looking for price to come into this zone and maybe give a reaction to continue up, or equally we could have just seen price melt to the downside. But I had this level marked just to see how price would react. And if we play price, so when price was here as well, you can see that we formed these two equal lows. Price broke this structure to the downside, and the last bit of internal liquidity we had before this imbalance was this just here. So I was also looking for a sweep of this liquidity for price to continue down. But if we play price, you can see that there was some sort of high impact news. So we did get that sweep. However, there was no valid entry. But what price did then, we came back into the area of demand that I mentioned. Going over to the 15 minute as well, you can see that price sweeps the low of that demand like this. And we had this 15 minute change of character. We go to the 5 minute, actually, it's a lot more clear. So we had a lower low, lower high, lower low. Price then creates a higher high just here. And also significantly, we left some imbalance down here. And this was the area I was looking to go off. At the time, this was the 5 minute demand. We had some liquidity resting above. So this was valid to set a limit. Stops just below the zone. And I was targeting this area of liquidity just here. And the reason I was targeting this is because this is the last bit of liquidity before this big imbalance. So I was expecting a reaction if price were to sweep this level. So if we place the order, You can see that price eventually came into our zone and then just immediately started to shift bullish back towards that previous liquidity. And as we can see, price just messes around for a while, comes back to the entry. Again, not making this break even because price is still respecting our blue zone. Therefore, the trade is still valid. And eventually, as you guys can see, price broke up, taking that liquidity as anticipated. So now what we've had is we've had that change of character. Price has pulled back and mitigated demand. And now we've had a further break of structure to the upside just here. So yeah, price broke structure once again. So at this point, we were looking for price to continue bullish. And the next point of interest I was interested in was this demand just here on the 30-minute. The reason was because this swept all of this liquidity to the left, which was the London low. And then after we had that sweep, price initiated this move to the upside. And I was looking to target, as a first target, this high just here, seeing it as an area of liquidity. And if we play price, eventually it did come back into our zone. So at this point, we went down to the 5-minute and we were looking for some buying opportunities. However, in this case, price just continued to the upside and never pulled back for a valid entry, as you can see, which again is completely fine. That happens sometimes. And eventually also price swept that area of liquidity that I mentioned, given a reaction to the downside. However, the reason that after a sweep of this, I didn't consider some sells was simply because price continued up once again, holding above this level. So I was no longer seeing this as a sweep. I was seeing it as a failure of this supply for price to continue higher back towards this previous high up here, which was then my next target for the buys. As for potential areas to get in, what I was seeing at the time was, if we draw on the mitigations again, we had a mitigation of this area of demand, and then price moved up, breaking structure just here. And then what I was seeing was we had this area of demand down here on the 30-minute, which was the last candle before this impulsive move. It also broke structure, and I was seeing this area of this sort of higher low here as an area of liquidity or inducement above this zone. So I was waiting at the time for price to come into my zone. And there we go. We eventually come into the zone. Again, I'm expecting price to continue up because we've just come into this empty imbalanced area and haven't really reacted from anything. On top of that, we are still bullish because price is chaining, meaning that it is mitigating demand and then breaking structure. So there's no reason to sell at this point in time. So yeah, we were waiting for some sort of confirmation within this zone. And the confirmation actually came once price did actually swept this zone. So you can see that we had this initial push, but price didn't break any structure. So there was no valid entry. But once we had a sweep of that zone, notice this impulsive reaction. I believe price then makes one more lower low. And then we had a break to the upside just here. So we had lower low, lower high, lower low, change of character creating a higher high. And then we also had the 15-minute create this point of interest, which was imbalanced demand, which swept liquidity to the left. So this was an entry. And I had a bit of a conservative stop below this wick because I thought that price may still want to come lower and take out some more liquidity. And the target for this trade was obviously the most recent high for around a 1 to 4. So it was a decent trade. And if we just play this now, price tags us in, flies to the upside. There was also another entry possibility. So if you were on the higher time frames, you would have probably viewed this as a breaker structure. This was really like the main lower high that you wanted to see break. If we go to the 30-minute as well, this was sort of like the last lower high before the lower low. Price then breaks into a higher high. And we also left this imbalanced area of demand just here. So if you missed that initial entry, this was the sort of next zone that you would want to get in on. And if we go back over to the group as well, so 20th of February, so where's GU? Let's have a look. Okay, so maybe not. I didn't call this zone actually, but even so, if we have a look how this area reacts, price makes that move up, we come back into demand, and then that's where price respects and continues over to the upside. So once again now, we have another breaker structure just here. And what I noticed at the time was on the 30-minute, we had this very clean level of demand as well, just here, which was the one that I was looking at for some potential buys. So again, just waiting for price to come into our zone, which it eventually did. So if we change the color, 5-minute is a valid entry point this time because it's a 30-minute point of interest. And the most recent lower high I was considering was this one. So that would be our change of character. And eventually price does break that level. However, for myself, this was all an efficient range. There was no imbalance, so there was not really a valid entry. So in the end, I just waited this one out and didn't get an entry, which is fine. You could have maybe gone off this 15-minute demand after price moved higher, but the reason that wasn't valid for me is because it didn't put in a new high. This was the 15-minute structure, and eventually that was liquidated as well. So this would have probably stopped us out because we wouldn't have had a stop loss all the way below the low. However, the analysis was good. Price did end up continuing over to the upside, as we can see. There was just no valid entry on this particular trade, which again is completely fine. And what price does then is, I believe it just continues up. Yeah, there we go. So what price has done now, we can get rid of all of this sort of internal trend. Since price has broke the main trend high, so the main trend, this was the initial break. We then have a pullback, and then this whole move up was the next leg of the trend. And then this was the main breaker structure just here. There we go. And if we also look at that on the 4-hour, we can see that price is once again still within this imbalance. So we are expecting a bigger move to the upside, and we don't expect price to just reverse from here. So if we just analyze this then, where could we see price pull back into for some more buys? So at the time, as we can see, there's not really any valid areas. All of this is sort of efficient now, and there's not really any clean looking points of interest. So I simply played price, and I was waiting until around this point here, where I saw that on the 15-minute, we had reacted from this sort of area of demand here, which as you can see was left in balance, and this wick induced it. Once price came into this 15-minute point of interest, we moved up, broke this lower high. So that was our change of character. And then what I also saw was that down below here, we had this 15-minute area of demand. And because of how price was moving at the time, because we had gotten like a very far distance away from the area I was looking to enter from, I didn't set a limit, but I was waiting for price to give another reaction and another confirmation within this blue zone. So if we play price, we can see that eventually it did that. Sort of messed around for a while at this point in time, just consolidating, which actually was a good thing for us, because this just meant price was building lots of liquidity above our zone. Another confluence I had for buying at this level was also we had all of this liquidity built up above here as well, where price gave like multiple taps of this one zone. So going over to the 5-minute now, because this is a 15-minute point of interest. Again, I was just waiting for a break of structure, which we can see that price eventually does. We have lower low, lower high, lower low, higher high, just here. And the area of demand that I could see at the time was this 5-minute area here. And the reason I like this one was because this wick swept liquidity to the left and caused imbalance. And another thing that validated the trade for me, we play price a little bit more, it also created some liquidity above the zone as it moved higher. So as we can see, this is a higher low. This is where people are buying, probably on some sort of fib retracement like this. So yeah, maybe the 382 or something like that. But either way, we can see that buyers are coming into the market here. So what do we expect price to do? We expect price to come a little bit lower, liquidate them, and then give a reaction to the upside. So we just had a limit here, 10 pip stop, and I was simply targeting this high just here because that gave a 1 to 3 and it aligned very nicely with an area of liquidity. As we can see, price comes into that zone, and that is exactly where it respects. So again, a tip for these entry areas, the highest probability ones are the ones which sweep liquidity, as with this. You can see that we wicked out previous buyers, then broke to the upside, and these levels nearly always give a reaction, allowing us to capitalize on some very nice moves. Okay, cool. So at this time, I didn't see any other trades, so I was just simply waiting for price to play out a little bit. Okay, so once I saw this, and once I saw that price had basically created a lower low, and also basically had created these two equal lows, I was looking for price to come a little bit lower before continuing to the upside. And at the time, I had this area of demand marked back up, because this was the area that price had initially reacted from. However, I dragged it to here because for this to be valid, I wanted to see a sweep of this previous liquidity. And just to show you that that's what we were looking for. So this was on the 1st of March. So going to the 1st of March, you can see that GU, we had this zone marked up with the blue line corresponding with that liquidity. And as you can see, we have the timer on as well. So it's live price. So yeah, at this time, I was just waiting for price to come lower before maybe giving us a confirmation for some buys. However, even though we did get that reaction, as you can see, this is exactly where price reacted from. Price never pulled back to my entry zone, which was this one here. And as you can see, price just decided to continue to the upside and never pulled back for us. And then this goes into March price action. So this was basically the end of February. So that concludes the back testing. I hope you all found this video useful. If you did, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and I will see you guys in next week's video.